everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Julie Stewart, and I organize webinars for the Claire Booth Lewis Center for Conservative Women. And we are so happy for you to join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Katie McFarland. Here at the Center for Conservative Women, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, and support free enterprise. We encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy in their schools, workplaces, and communities. If you are interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women, I invite you to visit our website at cdlwomen.org and follow us on all our social media platforms. We thank you for joining us today as we host Katie McFarland. Katie McFarland is one of the country's most prominent conservative foreign policy experts. She was President Trump's first Deputy National Security Advisor and helped develop his America First foreign policy. Prior to joining the Trump administration, she was Fox News' national security analyst. Mrs. McFarland appeared regularly on all Fox programs, hosted FoxNews.com's DEFCON 3, and wrote a regular column for the Fox Opinion page. She has held national security posts in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations, including as an aide to Dr. Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council. She received the Defense Department's highest civilian honor, the Distinguished Service Award, for her work at the Reagan administration. Katie is an alumna of George Washington University, Oxford, and MIT. She is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a board member of the American Conservative Union. And Katie McFarland was named Woman of the Year in 2015 by our very own Claire Booth Lewis Center for Conservative Women. Mrs. McFarland's knowledge of national security issues, past, present, and future is indispensable. She recently authored a book titled Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. Please join me today as we welcome Katie McFarland.
Wow, I mean, I sound really awesome, don't I? I certainly sound really old. Anyway, I'm so thrilled to be with you, all of you, because certainly as the mother of two grown daughters and grandmother of several granddaughters, I'm just really proud of the amazing lengths women have been able to achieve in my lifetime. I mean, that's just sort of a personal note. When I started working at the White House in 1970, I was a freshman in college and I worked the night shift. I was a night shift secretary for Henry Kissinger in the West Wing. And when I went into the White House in 1970, you know, women didn't have jobs like National Security Advisor. They could be secretaries, they could be waitresses, they could be nurses, they could be administrative assistants, but they never really could have achieved those kinds of positions. And when I then went back into the White House in 2017 as the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump, it was stunning to me. I mean, I ended up sitting at a desk that was about 6 feet from my original desk, but the world had changed so significantly in those 45 years to the point where it's now normal for the National Security Advisor to be a woman. And we've seen several women secretaries of state, and I think at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we have a woman who's president of the United States. Anyway, what I'd like to do is give you a broad overview of foreign policy and talk about why I, as a traditional Republican, traditional conservative, really broke with the Republican Party to join President Trump, and then explain what his policies are, because I don't think he does a very good job of explaining them. And then talk about where the world is now, sort of post-pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic. I don't know if you've all read the news today, but President Trump and the First Lady have both tested positive for coronavirus. They're asymptomatic at this point, but it really puts a very different complexion on everything in the world today. So I want to talk about that. And then I think I also want to talk about where Washington is today and where the state of politics are. And then I'm very happy to take your questions about everything, anything, you know, being a mother, being a grandmother, being one of the first women in my field, to the most intricate details of Chinese foreign policy. Okay, so let me start by saying, given my education and background, I was a traditional Republican foreign policy person. And about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I became very dissatisfied because I thought that the wars in the Middle East, the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, we weren't going to win them. And I didn't see what good we were getting out of them. And to me, we were propping up leaders who didn't like us in parts of the world that really didn't matter. And we were, in doing so, we were really harming our military. And I'm a strong military proponent. My daughter's a naval officer. I went to the Naval Academy. So I really thought we were doing wrong in those wars that we couldn't win. But and at the same time, we had taken our eye off the ball, that we were so focused on the Middle East and on terrorism that we didn't see the much bigger problem and threat to American security interests, which was on the horizon, which is a rising China, which wants to play by its own rules. So I broke with the Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney group of the Republican Party. And when Donald Trump came along, I supported him, because even though he really had no background in the national security issues, I thought he had a lot of common sense. I mean, I didn't like sometimes the tweets. Nobody likes the tweets. But I really thought this was a guy who gets it. He talks about China. He understands the strategic importance of China. And at the same time, he wants to get us out of Middle East wars. And he knows that you can't do that unless you make America energy independent of the Middle East. So I supported him, worked for him during the transition, and worked for President Trump as his first deputy national security advisor. I stayed about 5 months in the job. My first boss, Mike Flynn, General Flynn, was fired after 3 weeks. I remained on through a transition into the new national security advisor. And then I took some time off to write a book, and now I'm back talking about the issues that I really care deeply about. But the reason I liked what President Trump said, and he very kindly has given me the compliment of saying that I was one of the people who helped formulate his policies, which he continues to follow, he understood that if you just try to negotiating without changing the fundamental conditions doesn't make any difference at all. You just get the same results. So he understood that for the Middle East, you couldn't get out of the Middle East until you became energy independent and no longer needed the Middle East. And we fought wars in the Middle East because we needed to keep the oil spigot going. We had terrorism issues, which were made possible by Middle East oil and the money that gave radical groups in the Middle East. So he set out first to, quote, make America great again. Now, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't just mean make America great militarily, but it's economically, diplomatically, militarily, in every way, the same way that President Reagan in the 1980s set out to make America great again. For the same reasons. So Trump realized that first you have to rebuild the economy because America isn't great. Free market democracies don't work unless they're successful democracies. So he cut taxes, streamlined the federal regulatory system, and that helped the economy. But most importantly, in a lot of ways, is he pushed for American energy independence. And we had developed these new techniques of fracking that allowed America to all of a sudden go from being an energy importer to an energy exporter, that we would be self-sufficient ourselves and we'd have enough left over to sell. So he pushed for energy independence and achieved it very quickly in first natural gas and then oil. So how did that change the equation? Well, it made America great again because it made America great again financially, economically, jobs. It also made America great again because we no longer needed to be dependent on Middle East oil. Now, what did that do to the entire region? Well, that part of the world had really blackmailed us for 20, 30 years by saying, well, we want you to support us in this war. We want us to support you in that war. We're going to raise the oil prices if you support Israel. And we really were stuck kind of needing their oil, and so had to do their bidding. And we got in the middle of a lot of civil wars we didn't belong in. And by making America energy independent, we didn't need Middle East oil. We wouldn't be blackmailed. But in addition to that, it fixed the American economy right away because it meant we had a whole new industry, which was energy. And it meant that American manufacturing became very competitive because we had our own cheap energy. But at the same time, what it did was it drove the oil price down. Now that, you think, well, how does that make a difference? I guess it makes a difference when I go to the gas station. Yeah, but what it really does is it takes countries like Russia and the countries of the Middle East and Iran, for example, and it bankrupts them because they don't have anything else they export. I mean, who buys Iranian cars, right? Or who buys Russian computers? Nobody. They only buy Russian and Iranian and Sunni Arab oil and natural gas. So those countries had a real turnaround. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but that was how you made America great again, economically, and then you could do a lot of other things. But the other thing is that when President Trump says America first foreign policy, what does that mean? Well, it means that for decades, America has put other countries' interests first, often at our expense, because we thought that, well, if we help other countries become prosperous, they will become open societies, they will become our trading partners, and then the world is a better place, even though we might take a hit on American manufacturing and an economic hit in the short run. Now that made a lot of sense after World War II, and that's what we did with Japan, Germany, Korea, other countries in Europe. We helped them, we underwrote their economies at our expense, and they have become trading partners and they become allies, and that's great. We assumed China would do the same, and China didn't. China took advantage of the fact that the United States was helping them. And they, they did legal things, they did illegal things, but they had no intention of ever being our friendly trading partner. They always thought that they would be, eventually they could surpass us and that they would be the world dominant power, and they'd rewrite the rules according to what suited them. So when President Trump said, first make America great again, it was an economic plan, but you needed that economic plan before you could do all the rest. And all the rest is energy independence, a stronger American economy. And then it was also to go to our traditional allies and our adversaries and trading partners and said, game over. We're no longer going to, at our expense, underwrite your security in NATO or in our alliances in the Pacific. And we're certainly no longer going to underwrite your economies. These methods that we took were never meant to be permanent. We were only going to help you guys until you got on your feet. And you've been on your feet for a long time. We don't need to help you. So when President Trump went around to those countries, to the Germans, to the Chinese, to others, and said, okay, we want equal tariffs. We don't want to have a tax on American cars going into Germany, a tax of 25%, which is the tariff. And then the German cars coming into America, only a tariff of 2%. We want to have the same tariff. We'd like to have no tariffs. We trade freely. And of course, all the countries we have been underwriting said, no, we don't want to change. We love things the way they are. We love it, the fact that you're underwriting our economies. And so that's when the trade wars started. So make America great again is economic. And then America first is also economic, but it's using the newfound American power of a stronger economy to leverage, and it's a negotiating tactic with the other countries. So we're, fast forward into the Trump administration. What did all that mean? Well, it meant that we could go to the Germans. It meant we could go to the Europeans. It meant we could go to the Chinese and use our newfound economic prowess to negotiate better deals. And that's what Trump did. He negotiated a new trade agreement with Japan, with Korea, with Canada, Mexico. We're in the process of doing one with the Brits, and the Europeans will shortly follow. So we have negotiated a more equitable trading and relationship and investment relationship with those countries. Now, I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit from Asia to the Middle East, but I think that's how I want to tour the world with you. In the Middle East, what did that mean? Well, it meant that America was economically strong. We did it without being dependent on Middle East oil. And it put a lot of our adversaries in the Middle East in a very bad position because they didn't have the revenues to support a lot of the bad stuff they were doing. And so at the same time, President Trump used America's now newfound economic prosperity to rebuild the American military. And that's when he developed the policy that's called peace through strength. Now, originally it was President Reagan, and I was part of the team that helped develop that policy, peace through strength, in the 1980s. And what that meant was that we felt if America had the strongest military in the world, nobody picks a fight with a guy and loses, right? So if we have the strongest military in the world, we don't have to have a war because countries aren't dumb enough to challenge us. And if they are dumb enough to challenge us, well, we have the superior military and we can defeat them. So it was a way to maintain peace without ever going to war. It's if you want peace, and it's not anything new. It's a concept that goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. If you want peace, prepare for war, because you then deter the other side from ever attacking you. So these are the three foundations of the Trump doctrine. Make America great again, starting with the economy. America first, which is let's renegotiate all of our trade and security agreements with our allies and competitors so that we're on an even playing field for trade, and they also start contributing their fair share towards our common defense. And then the third is peace through strength. Strong military, don't pick fights with people, and understand that if they are dumb enough to pick a fight with you, you can defeat them. So that's the first term of the Trump administration. And I think it's the report card on that has been really successful. So let's take a tour around the world and I'll show you how successful it's been in various parts of the world. The Europeans. The first thing Trump did was he went to the NATO allies and said, look, we're paying 75% of the cost of our common defense here. And you guys have been freeloading. Well, every president has said that for 20 years. And they've said it, they've complained. The Europeans have said, yeah, we'll get to it. Not right now. We'll get to it soon. And they never got to it. So Trump has said he prodded them and he kicked them and he shoved them. And he said, look, we're thinking about leaving NATO. He doesn't want to leave NATO, but he said, we're thinking about leaving. You guys better pay up. And so as a result, the European nations in NATO, our allies, have now all increased their defense budgets, and they're paying $500 billion more towards our common defense than they had been. So that was a success. The second thing, though, was to go to some of those same countries and say, look, we're not going to let you put high tariffs on our manufacturers, our automobiles, for example, and then you get yours into the American market for no tariffs. We're going to use those tariff wars. So again, the Europeans said, well, we don't want to do that. We like it just fine, the way it is. And so that was the threat of tariffs. And indeed, it has brought the tariffs down and is resulting in a much more equitable trading playing field with trade. Then let's go to the Middle East. And how did America first affect the Middle East? Well, that actually has been one of the most stunning successes of the Trump administration, although you wouldn't think so if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and sadly watched CNN. Anyway, but what happened was that by early in the Trump administration, Jared Kushner and I were in the Situation Room with a number of other people, and we were talking about, well, who in the Middle East are we going to support? Who are we going to connect with in the different countries? And he said, well, I think we should look at the next generation of leaders, particularly in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the Sunni Gulf oil countries. And I, dumb me, said, well, our traditional allies in these countries have been the senior people, the fathers, the uncles of the ones you're talking about. And the ones you're talking about are too young. And he said, well, no, he said, in all of those countries, 75% of the population in those countries is under the age of 35. So for them, for the majority of their population, this next generation of leaders, they're contemporaries. They're not young guys. And so he had a really good point. And then Jared, and I give him full credit for this, Jared Kushner went out and cultivated the relationships with the next generation of Saudi, Emirati, et cetera, leaders in the Middle East. And at the same time, President Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, why is that important? Well, American presidents have promised to do it forever, and they never have. They've always been afraid that the Arab countries would be angry if the United States moved its embassy to the capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem, because the Arabs claim it's their capital too. Well, President Trump did it, and what it did politically, first of all, there was no bad reaction from the Arab world, and secondly, it gave him the political leverage in Israel that he needed, the sort of political breathing space that the Israeli prime minister needed to cut a deal in the Middle East with the Arabs. The third thing they did was Iran. we had had an Iran nuclear deal with the Iranian government. The Obama administration negotiated it. I think it was extremely flawed. So did President Trump, because it didn't stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. It just delayed it for a couple of years. So President Trump pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, and then he started squeezing the Iranian economy with sanctions. And because Iran's only business is exporting oil, the sanctions really hurt. And all of a sudden, they didn't have enough money to support the terrorist movements they were supporting throughout the Middle East. The next thing that happened was, by attacking and killing the leader of the Iranian terrorist network, his name is General Qasem Soleimani. He was killed about a year ago. And not only he, but the sort of senior lieutenants that really orchestrated and carried out the terrorist attacks throughout the Middle East, they were neutered. So you now have an Iran, which was the troublemaker in the Middle East, broken, neutered. You have a new relationship with the Sunni leadership. And I think it's important because people don't really focus on this, but I'm going to take an aside and tell you. There are two kinds of Muslim religion, right? There's the Sunnis, and think of them as the Protestants, I guess. And then there are the Shiites, and they have tended to embrace radicalist movements much more. The other change in the Middle East, or the other big component in the Middle East, is there are several tribes. So there's the Jews, that's Israel, that's one tribe. There are the Persians, that's Iran. And then there are the Arabs. The Arabs and Persians don't like each other. The Arabs are the guys in Saudi Arabia. They're the ones who live in the desert. They're Lawrence of Arabia Arabs. So by making the break between the Sunni Arabs and the Shiite Persians, the US and Donald Trump was able to negotiate a whole new deal. So the whole Middle East has been rearranged in the last couple of months. Now, I know that's a lot of detail to absorb, but what it means, the ramifications of it, I've told you how they were able to carefully pull it off. But what it means in the Middle East is that now, for the first time, you have a peace agreement between Jews and Arabs, and the incentive is for them to not go to war. The incentive for the Iranians is still to go to war, but they don't have the means to do it. And by cultivating that younger generation of leaders in the Middle East, Jared Kushner was able to tell them, and they could see it for themselves. Most of them are European or American educated. They're very comfortable in Western society. They knew that once the price of oil went down forever, they needed to modernize their economies and modernize their societies. And that's who the deal was made with. So you now have a Middle East where the ISIS is dead, the radical Islamic movements are more or less bankrupt and neutered. The rising groups in the Middle East are going to be the modernizers, the people who want to modernize their economies and societies, and they've just had a peace agreement with Israel. So what you're going to see looking ahead in the Middle East is there'll be an economic boomtown. It's going to be like the California gold rush. The Jews and the Arabs are going to reinvest. They're going to invest in each other's countries and each other's businesses, and you'll see an economic renaissance, an economic renaissance. So what does that mean for us? Why do we care? Well, you still got cheap gas at the gas station, but all of a sudden, the Middle East, which has plagued America for decades, between high oil prices, between wars in the Middle East, between terrorists, between Al-Qaeda, between ISIS, that's gone. And so the Middle East is now going to, I think, become an area of peace and prosperity. Other countries are in line in the pipeline to join these Abraham Accords, which is what was negotiated just a few weeks ago. And I think that means the United States no longer has to be subject to the blackmail and everything else that's been going on in the Middle East. They're now free to develop their own destinies. We don't need to be in the middle of it. The next big change, though, is China. I mean, that's the elephant in the room. And China, we had understood, and the reason I supported President Trump right from the beginning is he understood that the long-term threat the Chinese had against the United States was not that they wanted to join the world order that has kept the peace for 70 or 80 years. They wanted to break the world order, and they wanted themselves to be in charge. and then they could dictate to the rest of the world how to behave. Now, how were they going to pull this off? Well, number one, they were going to dominate trade. So the Chinese, and they're very open about this, they have documents that talk about it, their president talks about it, they have plans to do it, but they were going to dominate world trade. And they were going to do it through a land-based trade route called the One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road. And that was to link Europe, the Middle East, South Asia to China. So there would be a new, like, super highway of trade that the Chinese would control. The second way was maritime trade. So they were building, and they continue to build, ports throughout, linking the east coast of Africa, the Middle East and energy, through South Asia, through the South China Sea, which has historically been open to everybody, like the Pacific Ocean is open to everybody. The Chinese have now said, no, that's not open to everybody. It's a Chinese lake, and we're going to decide who comes and goes. So that was their second thing, a maritime trade route. The next thing they were going to do is they have a plan called China 2025. They want to dominate the 10 technologies of the future by 2025. And that's artificial intelligence, robotics, microprocessing, yada, yada, yada. The next and final and probably most crucial part of it was they want to dominate the infrastructure of the internet. So the 5G, I'm sure you've heard reference to 5G infrastructure, 5G networks. We're building a 5G network in the United States, the Europeans, everybody's doing it. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't just mean you get faster Netflix downloads. The internet of the future, 5G, will be the Internet of Things. And historically, either the United States or Europeans or other countries have made the equipment of the Internet of the day. The Chinese want to build the Internet of the future. And that means they could make you dark, they could turn it on, they could turn it off, they could listen to what you're saying. They really would have the commanding heights of technology. So the Chinese have been planning to do all of these things, and they were well on their way to doing them when Trump was elected president. And his idea at first initially was, let's negotiate with them. Maybe we can have a win-win. China can rise, but not at the expense of the world. And that's where we were until the pandemic hit. And the pandemic has changed everything. The Chinese planned, with their careful plan, dominating maritime trade, land-based trade, the technologies of the future, artificial intelligence, the 5G network, they figured by mid-21st century they'd be in charge. But the pandemic has accelerated their plans. And here's how they've done it. People are still arguing, how did the coronavirus come about? Was it in a lab, in a biological weapons lab in Wuhan, China, or was it in a wet market where live bats were sold and somehow bats transferred the virus to people? It doesn't really matter. What matters is what the Chinese did next. And they used the coronavirus as a biological weapon. They told the world, nothing to worry about here. It's not much. It doesn't really get transferred human to human. Don't worry about it. And they were locking down, at the same time, they were locking down their own country. They just weren't letting anybody know. So they prevented travel from one part of China to another, but they allowed travel, encouraged travel from Wuhan, China to Europe, to the United States, to Africa. And so they knowingly spread the virus worldwide. Now, what they did during the interim of, say, 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe even 6 weeks, while they were spreading the virus all over the world, was that they used that time to corner the market on medicines, on testing equipment, on personal protective, the masks. They used that time to corner the market. They've also, now that the world is now, we're all coping with it. Look at the American economy. Look at American statistics of health. Look at Europe. Look at the shutdowns. I'm sure most of you, if you're still in college, are you doing this virtually? You're not back at campus at sorority parties right now. So the coronavirus has been a wake-up call to the world, and particularly the way the Chinese have exploited it. Not just that it happened, not just that it was spread, but what they've done since. Now, they have something called wolf warrior diplomacy. They are very proud of the fact that they are blackmailing countries. Remember that, you probably don't remember, but there was a brief, like a week, when Donald Trump was praising the Chinese handling of the coronavirus. You want to know why? Not because we were praising them, but because they came to the United States and they said, if you say anything bad about us, about how we handle this, we're going to cut off all antibiotics and Tylenol to the United States. It's all made in China. We're going to cut it off. They went to the Europeans and they said to the Europeans, they said to the Italians and the Spanish particularly, they said, you complain about us, we are going to make sure that you don't have any access to testing equipment. So the Europeans said, oh yeah, okay, fine. Then so they said nice things about the Chinese, but everybody has now been exploited and sees what the Chinese are up to. They want to take full advantage of this. And as long as we let them, they're going to keep going and taking advantage of it. So what's the wake-up call? What do you do in a second Trump term? Or what has Trump done in the last couple of months? It's accepting and understanding what the Chinese are doing. And you can complain about it, but that doesn't change things. You have to change your behavior to change things. So the first thing is that we've started doing is we're bringing the supply chains home. We're protecting American technology from intellectual property theft, and we are bringing the supply chains home. We are not going to get the phone call to say, we're cutting off your penicillin, America. We're bringing those home. And that's already started happening. The second thing, and that this is something that's very, happening right now, is that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is a good friend of mine. He's gone around the world to the countries who have been exploited by the Chinese. And we're building a coalition. So he's gone to the Brits, he's gone to the Europeans, Japan, Korea, and said, look, we're all democracies. We are all free market systems. If we band together and stand together to the Chinese, we will say to them, not we want to bury you, but we demand that you play by the rules. You don't steal intellectual property. You don't force our markets. You have equal investment. If we invest in your country, you can invest in our country. We are going to all play by the same set of rules. And if the Chinese choose not to do that, as they so far have become very aggressive with this wolf warrior diplomacy, then we have the makings of a decoupled system like we had during the Cold War, where we have our own trading partners and we would really do trade with our European partners. But that's a year or two down the road. We're still in the middle of that one. So I look at, so where is the world today? Where is the world going? The pandemic has been a terrible thing for everybody, and we're not out of it yet. In fact, as I just said, President Trump has just tested positive, asymptomatic. Our prayers go with him. But what has the pandemic done? I think it's an opportunity. I mean, it's a terrible thing, and it's really hurt our economies, and it's really put us at each other's throats. But it's also an opportunity. Why? The United States is going to spend a lot of money trying to restart our economy. But why not invest that money in technology and use the opportunity that this has given us to say, okay, those manufacturing jobs, they're not coming back. We're not going to make tennis shoes in America. We may not even make cars in America, but what can we make? We can make high technology equipment, and let's bring that home. So let's invest in training our American workers to a very different kind of technology and a different part of an economy. The next thing that we can do is to look at how things have changed with our education systems. Everybody's going to school online. Well, you know what? The American education system was kind of broken for the last several years. We're educating people for jobs that don't exist. So why not? And we're spending, what are your student loans? $10,000, $100,000 more? Why are we borrowing money to train ourselves for jobs that may not exist? So I think that there's a real opportunity for the education system to change. Not to have everybody go online and hide under the bed, but maybe a change there. There's also another opportunity to change medicine, telemedicine. So I think that we can take advantage of the silver lining in this, how you make lemonade out of lemons, is that you take all of these technologies that we have been forced to deal with. I mean, when we were starting this, Julie and I, we were having a little trouble with the technology. Guess what? This should be easy technology, and it should be user-friendly to everybody. So I think that this is a silver lining for the United States because we're innovators. We're inventors, we're entrepreneurs, we're good at this stuff. So I think that that would be one direction we can go to really help us going forward. Now, look, there's no denying that the country is just ripping each other apart. And the debates and the media and the Russia hoax and all that other stuff, I think has done a great disservice to the nation. But I am a firm believer that the United States goes through periods of creative destruction. And I think that's what we're in right now. I think if I look back at American history, and this is what I talk about at the end of my book, beginning of my book, I talk about what I've just talked to you about. In the middle of my book, I talk about the Mueller investigation and how I was targeted to try to bring down President Trump, and I wouldn't do it. But the final part is how we all think, oh, it's never been this bad. America's in terrible shape. It's terrible trouble. This is so awful. But I think actually America has been in trouble before. It's always been different. And we get in trouble like this every 40 years or so, and we have since the very beginning. We have in the American Revolution, what did we do? We threw out the existing ruling class and we governed ourselves. In the 1830s, 1840s, Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy, threw out the ruling class in Washington and created a new set of leaders. We did the same thing during the Industrial Revolution. We did the same thing during the Depression and World War II. We did the same thing with Reagan, and I think that's what we're doing now. And why does it happen? It's because American society is so constantly changing. It's not just because of immigration, but it's because, we innovate, our technology changes, we move around the country, our demographics change. We're constantly evolving as a society. And yet government, Washington, by its very nature, it doesn't evolve. I mean, governments are status quo institutions. They just want to grow bigger, take more power, have more money, give less authority to the people in the country. And I think that the Constitution and our founding fathers, they understood this sort of fundamental dichotomy that governments would always be status quo and try to grab and hold on to their power and not change. And yet American society was always going to change. So they gave us the right to have a political revolution, a peaceful political revolution. And we seem to have it every 40 years. And what happens during these peaceful political revolutions? They don't happen in one election. It takes usually 5, 7, 10 years even. And they're horrible to go through. I mean, in the Civil War, we fought. In the Revolutionary War, we fought. In the Great Depression, we had a depressed society, a depressed economy. These times are always destructive, but they're also creative because out of the sort of the terribleness and the divisiveness of it, we look around and we say, look, this old generation of leaders, these guys who are all fighting with each other, not getting the job done, let's get rid of them. And we get a new generation of leaders. We get new technologies. We have new social media. We have new kinds of ways to communicate with each other. So I think that's what we're going through right now. The Republican Party, we had our Civil War in 2016. It was the traditional Republicans versus the conservative Trump Republicans. Now, a lot of those never Trumpers, they're Democrats now. And a lot of the working class Democrats, they're Republicans now. The Democrats, they're having their Civil War right now. It's the Joe Biden Democrats versus the AOC, Antifa, riot in the cities, reparations, they call it progressive. I don't think there's anything progressive about it at all. But that part of the socialist part of the Democrat Party. So they're going through their Civil War now. Who knows how that'll end? But I think in America's going to go through one more election, maybe even another presidential election before we figure it out and before a new generation of leaders comes. And that's why I'm going to get back to why I think it's so important for you, especially young women. You're the future. Your generation is now the generation that's taking those positions. A lot of you are out of college. You're starting your first jobs. The millennials, you're an amazing generation of people. The millennials are. You're innovative. You're creative. You're inventing stuff. The internet, the social media. You're just an explosively exciting generation. And as young women, you're the key to everything. The key to the last 4 presidential elections has been women. Suburban women, college-educated suburban women. How did they vote? Well, in 2000, they voted for George W. Bush. They were the soccer moms. And then in 2004, they reelected George Bush. They were security moms. That was after September 11th. And then in 2008, they elected Barack Obama because they thought that he promised a post-racial society and sort of a new vision of America. They reelected him. And then they voted for Donald Trump. Now, these are not necessarily Republicans or Democrats. They don't necessarily say, I'm always voting for this, I'm always voting for that. They're educated swing voters. And that's why you're so important. I mean, you wouldn't be part of this unless you had conservative principles. You'd be going to AOC rallies. But you are. You're educated, you're women of conservative principle, and it's your responsibility, not just to go to the polls yourself, but to educate other women of your generation. And so I, as a mother of daughters, and one has just turned 30, one is 34, and the lives that they're living and the influence that they're going to have as young women, conservative but ambitious and exciting and innovative and creative, you more than anybody in this country are the future. So I am so proud to be associated with the Claire Booth Lewis Society and for young women. And so, you know, I just wish I could do it all over again because you're going to have one heck of a ride. So that's enough out of me. Thank you very much. And I would love to take your questions. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And it's just so much information. It was lovely.
I know. Guess what? There's no quiz at the end. So this is the best lecture you've ever had.
That's an excellent point. We have questions just rolling in. So we're going to start with, please discuss how to deal with the congressional Democrats who seem to be so anti-American prosperity and safety.
Yeah. How did the Democrats?
Just a big question.
No, I mean, I think that they're gonna have to just be roundly defeated at the polls. And one good way is the courts, because we will get, you know, the Judge Barrett will be confirmed. It'll be a nasty fight, I'm sure, but she will be confirmed for the Supreme Court. So that then changes the courts, the whole direction of the courts. And what nobody talks about much is how President Trump really focused more than anything. You know, he's always criticized where you had an acting this and an acting that. You never had this guy confirmed. You never had that woman confirmed. Guess what? The confirmations were all going to judges, and they will last not 2 or 3 years, they'll last 20 or 30 years. So that's been good. But the Democrats, I think you just have to call them out every single time. And the way you get, congressional elections are not that big. It's not like a presidential election. Congressional elections in a number of districts are decided by 1,000 votes, 5,000 votes. So those are places you can all get active. And the one thing I would say to every single one of you, this is your time. You know, if you think, oh, well, I really, I don't have time to volunteer for a campaign, or, I think I'll run for something when, when I've paid off the mortgage on my house or my apartment, or after I've gotten married, or whatever. Don't do it. Just do it. Get in there now. Because this is when you don't have the responsibilities. This is when you don't have a lot riding on you. This is when you can take chances. This is why so many of your generation are so innovative and entrepreneurial at a very young age. This is when you can take risks, and this is when you can fail. So this is the time that you need to jump in. Work for a campaign. Help, write an op-ed. Be a candidate yourself. Encourage your pals to run for office. When you go vote in November or whenever you're going to vote, bring along 2 friends. Have them vote too. And become engaged and become excited about it. Because if you don't, look, America, if we don't have conservatives in office for the next 5 or 7 years, it's over, because that means the AOC people, the socialists, they'll have won. They'll have screwed up the American economy. We'll be fighting with each other. The Chinese will plow ahead. So this is your time. And if you don't take a time, if you don't get involved and excited about this period of time, you're just going to you're going to regret it in 20 or 30 years. You know, you're the revolutionary generation, not me. I've had my revolution. Mine was the Cold War. I won that war, but it's yours. And so how do you deal with the Democrats? Call them out. I think that the other thing that I would really say to all conservatives, you know, we're always trying, we're so nice. You know, when people accuse the conservatives of this or that or the other thing, we try to sort of say, oh no, we're not like that. We're not that bad. Just reject it. We are good people. We have great values, and don't be on the defensive, and call them out for the bad stuff that they're doing. So there's no advice other than just step by step by step, standing up to them.
Wow. Wow. It's a good challenge for all of the young women that follow us. Another question that's very unique is, what does a day in the life of a Deputy National Security Advisor look like?
It's really long. Okay, it starts theoretically, it starts at like 5:30 with half an hour of exercise. Probably not. What it does start with is immediately looking at overnight cables, or, you know, just a glance through the media, and then going to the White House in the West Wing, and then immediately sitting down with at the briefer, the individual from the intelligence community who will talk to you about all the sort of things that have happened overnight, or all the things that you've asked the day before to look at. So it's really a tour of the world of, oh, we think there's going to be a coup in Tanzania, or we're worried because Americans have been taken hostage in Corsica, or the Chinese are making very bold moves in the South China Sea. So it's to inform yourself, it's to get educated about the important issues of the day. And the next part of the day is, the next part of the morning is to go into the president and meet with the president in the morning. And again, go over the national security issues. It's called the President's Daily Brief. And it can be written on paper, it can be orally briefed. President Trump prefers not to read. I think he's a little dyslexic, but he remembers everything he hears. And so for us, the better way to brief President Trump was always in person and orally. When I worked for President Nixon, he was just the opposite. He didn't like a lot of people in the Oval Office, and he wanted to read at great length. So you adapt to the president that you serve. The next part of the day, though, is a lot of what's called interagency meetings. Now, this may be a little bit in the weeds, but the Deputy National Security Advisor, in fact, is one of the most powerful people in Washington, because he or she chairs daily meetings with all of the other agencies and departments to hammer out the policies of an administration, or to make advice to the president, and then to take the advice of the president and then disperse it. So what I did the first week of the Trump administration, I called into the White House Situation Room the deputy, the number 2 at Treasury, at Justice, the number 2 FBI director, the number 2 at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, and we sat around the room, and I said, now President Trump wants us to go through American foreign policy and do a status report. You know, where have we been and how are we going to change it? What new ideas could we come up with? So one of the first ones I did was North Korea. And so I went around the room. Now remember, Trump hadn't had anybody confirmed yet. It was early on, and a couple of days into the administration, we still didn't have a Secretary of State confirmed at that point. So I'm going around and I'm asking them all, well, what about our Korea policy? And they all gave me the canned version. And I sat back after 20 minutes of this and I said, look, guys, this is what we've been doing for 5 years. Why do you think it's going to be successful now? It wasn't successful before. There's no chance. And so I looked around the room and I thought, well, of course they're telling me what they've been doing before, because these guys were all Obama administration people. So we have to really probably wait for the Trump people to be confirmed and in office. But what I said was, look, all of you, go back to your agencies and take a fresh look at this stuff. Technology has changed. The last time you probably looked at this was 5 years ago of North Korea. Go look again. Where are they in their nuclear program? What vulnerabilities do they have with their economy? What's their relationship with China? And I want you guys to think outside the box. And then I used my hands and I said, I want you to think at this end, think of maybe we remove Kim Jong-un from power, regime change. I said, maybe on the other hand, we accept him as a nuclear weapons state and welcome him into the world of the international community. Or maybe what we do is use covert means, or maybe what we do is use cyber means. Maybe we use military things. So go back, think outside the box, nothing, don't rule anything out, and then come back to me in a week's time and let's bounce some ideas around. So they did, and they came back. The rest of the National Security Advisors Day is I would meet with the North Korea experts of every agency of government so that I could get really, really into the weeds and informed. So when the number 2 deputies of all the departments came back to the Situation Room, and I went around the room and they all had a little bit. None of them had enough that would be an easy turn it off, turn it on policy that would change the behavior of the North Koreans. But everybody had a little. So then what I did was okay, Treasury says we could do more sanctions. The State Department says that we could pressure some Chinese banks to not do business with North Korea. The cyber guys say we have a lot of opportunities to interfere in their program, their nuclear program. The military guys say, look, we could do a lot more exercises in the South China Sea. So we were able to take these little threads and then knit them together to what was called the maximum pressure campaign. And so what President Trump did was we would negotiate, we would welcome them to the table. But once they came, we didn't stop the pressure, we kept dialing it up. In the past, every administration has put pressure on. The North Koreans came to the negotiating table. The minute they arrived, we let the pressure up. No, we were going to keep the pressure going. So that's the biggest part of the Deputy National Security Advisor's job, is to come up with the plans that then you can tell to the president. And then the president says, oh, I think that's really stupid, and I want to do this instead. So then you go back and you have those same people together. So it's the ultimate insider's job, because you're not on TV, you're not making speeches, you're not sort of getting all the accolades, but man, you have a lot of authority and power.
Wow, that sounds completely fascinating. We have so many questions. What is Turkey as a member of NATO seems to be a bit of a problem, and how do you think that's going to come out with the recent war in Armenia? Is Russia going to get involved and kind of conflict with Turkey at this point?
Wow, whoever asked that question is really smart and really well informed. Okay, so Turkey's a member of NATO, and Turkey has always been, I don't know, problematic, I think, because they're not a democracy. They started out as a democracy, a secular democracy, and slowly but surely they have been going in a very different direction in the last several years. I, for one, am not happy that Turkey is a member of NATO. I think that to have nuclear weapons in a country that we can't really trust, I think is a very bad idea. But the gist of the question, and I won't go into the details about Armenia, but let's look at the geopolitics of it. So who are the bad guys that we worry about in the world? And particularly, who are the bad guys that might get together and cause us problems? Turkey and Iran together, Turkey, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Iran, China, Russia. That's the nightmare scenario. So what do we do about it? Well, I think we've done good by Iran. I mean, from our perspective, which is we've bankrupted them and we've squeezed them. The Russians, even though I had initially thought a couple of years ago we might be able to improve relations with the Russians, I don't think so. But the other thing we've done is by squeezing them economically, they're in less of a position to make trouble. But the real nightmare is if the Chinese connect to the Iranians and get oil, they connect to the Russians with Russian weapon systems, they connect with Turkey because of its geographic position, and it's all bankrolled by China. And I think that's the big crisis threat that the next 10 years will have, is how do we prevent that from happening? And if it does happen, how do we neuter the effects and defend against it? And I don't have the answer for that right now. The only thing I would hope is that, let's say Trump gets a second term, and the Iranian economy and the Iranians are so squeezed they have to make a deal with the United States, similarly to the Russians. If Trump's not reelected, I think that nightmare scenario I've talked about, that happens. That happens almost immediately, because Biden or whoever is really running the show, if Biden's president, will not stand up to China. They've already been bought off by the Russians, and they'll go back to their Iran love affair. So I think that would be, you know, that nightmare scenario happens a lot sooner than anybody wants if it's a Biden Harris or a Biden whoever's in charge administration.
Wow, thank you. The final question, we're coming up on our time, but what books have you been reading lately, and what books do you recommend for others to read who have a similar interest?
Well, for sure, you're reading my book, right? And if you don't read it, get the audiobook. Yeah, there we go. I've taken this time, so lockdown and the pandemic, I know a lot of people have been really hurting, but for me and for our family, it's actually been okay. We went to Florida. We live in New York, in Long Island, and we went to Florida, Sarasota in March, because our older daughter, Fiona McFarland, and you can Google it right now, FionaForFlorida.com. She's a Naval Reserve officer, and she's running for the Florida State House in her first election. And she won the primary, and so she's, you know, November is the date, and I think she will win, and she'll be that next generation of leaders in Florida. But because she had a baby the first week of the lockdown, my husband and I went to go visit our new grandson in Florida, and then we just stayed. We stayed for 5 months. And so for us, we really got to see our daughter as a mother. We got to know our son-in-law, and we really got to know our sweet little grandson. So I wasn't doing much reading during that time, but what I have done is take the time, and I think even more importantly than reading right now, is take the time to think, what do you want from your life? Now, the pandemic has brought a lot of stuff right to the fore. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people right now who are watching, you're probably living at home with your parents. What kind of a relationship do you want with them? I mean, normally we would have just sort of scooted along following the same path. But I think it's really been a wake-up call for a lot of people of what kind of a life do I want to lead? Do I want to work 80 hours a week? Do I want to work remotely? Where do I want to live? What kind of a life do I want to have? So I take advantage of the time that you might be reading my book to contemplate your life. What am I personally reading? Well, I've gone back to reread the Harry Potter books. I read them first as a mother with kids that age and read them continuously for years, but I've gone back to read them again, and they're really terrific reads. And the more boring reading I'm doing is, you know, the foreign policy stuff, but Harry Potter's fun.
Well, that sounds so interesting. I know the girls will take that in stride for sure. So we are coming to the end of the webinar. We thank you so much, Ms. McFarland. Your time has just been so valuable for everyone, and we really appreciate your expertise and sharing your knowledge. And we would just like to show the cover of her book, an excellent read to learn more and to really grow your knowledge of foreign policy and current events. So we thank you all for attending so much. And if you have any more questions about the Claire Boothe Center for Conservative Women, just visit our website or follow us on all of our platforms, social media. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Mrs. Farland, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a truly honor for us.
Thank you.